Rashomon. Ryunosuke Akutagawa. It was toward evening on a certain day. A single servant was waiting beneath Rashomon for the rain to stop. Under the wide gate, there was no one besides this man. Only a single cricket had perched on one of the great round pillars, its vermilion paint peeled away here and there. Since Rashomon stood on Suzaku Avenue, it would have been natural for there to be 2 or 3 others as well. Women in ichimegasa hats or men in soft taboshi caps, also waiting for the rain to stop. Yet there was no one besides this man. The reason was that, over the past 2 or 3 years, Kyoto had been visited again and again by calamities, earthquakes, whirlwinds, fires, famines, and so the desolation of the capital had been beyond ordinary measure. According to old records, people had even smashed Buddhist images and ritual implements, then piled the wood by the roadside, wood still marked with vermilion or bearing gold and silver leaf, and sold it as firewood. If the city within the capital had fallen to such a state, then naturally no one gave a thought to repairing Rashomon, and so, taking advantage of its ruin, foxes and badgers made it their lair. Thieves made it their lair. In the end, there even arose the custom of bringing to this gate unclaimed corpses and abandoning them there. So once the daylight faded, everyone felt a creeping dread, and no one would venture into the neighborhood of this gate. Instead, crows came flocking in from somewhere, in great numbers. In the daytime, one could see those crows, countless in number, wheeling in circles and crying as they flew around the high shibi ornaments. Especially when the sky above the gate turned red with the evening glow, they stood out clearly, like sesame seeds scattered across it. The crows had come, of course, to peck at the flesh of the dead bodies above the gate. Though today, perhaps because the hour was already late, not a single one was to be seen. One could only see on the stone steps that were crumbling here and there, with long grass growing from their cracks, the white droppings of crows clinging in scattered spots. The servant sat on the topmost of the 7 steps, settling the seat of his well-washed indigo jacket beneath him, absently watching the rainfall, while troubling over the large pimple on his right cheek. A moment ago, the author wrote, the servant was waiting for the rain to stop. But even if the rain did stop, the servant had no particular idea what he was to do. Ordinarily, of course, he should have returned to his master's house, but 4 or 5 days earlier, that master had dismissed him. As has already been written, the city of Kyoto at that time was declining beyond all measure, and the fact that this servant, who had served for many years, had now been turned away by his master was in truth nothing more than one small ripple from that larger decline. So rather than saying the servant was waiting for the rain to stop, It would be more fitting to say the servant, trapped by the rain, had nowhere to go and stood at a loss. And beyond that, the state of the sky that day also had no small effect upon the sentimentaliz of this servant of the Heian court. The rain, which had begun to fall from the latter part of the hour of the monkey, showed no sign even now of letting up. So the servant, determined at least somehow to manage tomorrow's living before anything else, that is, to somehow manage what could not possibly be managed, had been following one aimless thought after another, while all the while, since some time ago, he had been listening, without really listening, to the sound of rain falling on Suzaku Avenue. The rain wrapped itself around Rashomon, gathering from afar the sound of a long, rushing downpour. The evening darkness gradually lowered the sky, and when one looked up, the roof of the gate seemed to be holding up heavy, dim clouds on the tips of its slanting tiles. If one was to make something possible out of what could not be helped, there was no time to choose the means. If he chose, he would only end by starving to death beneath the earthen wall, or on the dirt by the roadside, and then he would only be brought to the top of this gate and thrown away like a dog. If he did not choose, the servant's thoughts, after wandering again and again along the same path, had at last arrived at this point. And yet this if remained, no matter how long he waited, nothing but an if. Though he acknowledged that he must not choose the means, he still could not summon the courage to settle this if by positively affirming what should naturally have followed after it, that he had no choice but to become a thief. The servant gave a great sneeze and then rose to his feet with an air of weariness. Kyoto, chilled by the evening cold, had already grown so cold that one could wish for a brazier. The wind swept without restraint between the pillars of the gate, together with the gathering dusk. The cricket that had been perched on the vermilion pillar had already gone somewhere, shrinking his neck into his shoulders. The servant raised high the shoulders of the dark blue jacket he wore over his yellow underrobe and looked around the gate. If there were some place where he need fear neither rain nor wind nor the eyes of others, somewhere he might sleep in ease for one night, then he would at least pass the night there somehow. Then, fortunately, he noticed the broad staircase leading up to the tower above the gate, this too painted in vermilion. If he went up there, even if there were people, they would be nothing but corpses. So the servant, careful that the sacred hilted sword hanging at his waist should not slip from its scabbard, set his straw-sandaled foot upon the lowest step of the staircase. Then, some minutes later, in the middle of the broad staircase that led up to the Tower of Rashomon, a man crouched, drawn in upon himself like a cat, holding his breath and peering upward to see what was above. The light of a fire, shining from the upper floor, faintly touched the man's right cheek. It was a cheek with a red, festering pimple set among short whiskers. From the beginning, the servant had assumed that whoever was up there could only be the dead. But when he climbed 2 or 3 steps and looked, it seemed that someone above had lit a fire and was moving that fire here and there. He knew it at once because that murky yellow light, wavering, was reflected upon the cobwebbed recesses of the ceiling in every corner. On a rainy night like this, for a fire to be burning above Rashomon, whoever it was, it could not be an ordinary person. The servant, stealing his footsteps like a gecko, at last crept up the steep staircase as if crawling until he reached the very top. Then, flattening his body as much as he could and stretching his neck as far forward as possible, he peered with fearful caution into the tower. And there, just as rumor had said, a number of corpses lay cast aside without ceremony. But the reach of the firelight was narrower than he had expected, so he could not tell how many there were. What he could make out, dimly, was only that among them were naked corpses and corpses still clothed in garments. Of course, it seemed that women and men were mixed together among them, and all of those corpses to such a degree that one might even doubt the fact that they had once been living human beings, lay strewn over the floor like dolls made of kneaded clay, their mouths open, their hands outstretched. Moreover, where the shoulders or the chest rose higher, they caught the dull light of the fire, while making the shadows in the lower parts all the darker. And so they remained silent forever, like the mute. At the rotting stench of those corpses, the servant involuntarily covered his nose, but in the next instant, his hand had already forgotten to cover it, for some powerful emotion had almost completely robbed this man of his sense of smell. At that moment, the servant's eyes, for the first time, saw the human being crouching among those corpses. It was an old woman, dressed in a cypress bark-colored robe, short, thin, white-haired, ape-like. In her right hand, she held a lit pine splinter, and with it was gazing as though peering into the face of one of the corpses. Judging by the length of the hair, it was probably the corpse of a woman, driven by 6 parts fear and 4 parts curiosity. The servant, for a while, forgot even to breathe. To borrow the phrase of the writer of the old records, he felt as though even the hairs on his head and body had grown thick. Then the old woman stuck the pine splinter into a crack between the floorboards, and placing both hands on the head of the corpse she had been gazing at, began to pluck out its long hair, one strand at a time, just as a mother monkey picks lice from her baby monkey. The hair seemed to come away obediently with each movement of her hand. and as the hair was pulled out, strand by strand, the servant's fear, little by little, began to disappear. At the same time, a fierce hatred toward this old woman began, little by little, to stir within him. No to say, toward this old woman, may perhaps not be quite accurate. Rather, his revulsion against all evil was growing stronger with every passing moment. At that instant, if someone had brought before this servant once more the question he had been turning over beneath the gate, whether to starve to death or become a thief, then most likely he would have chosen starvation without the slightest regret. So fiercely had this man's hatred of evil begun to blaze up like the pine splinter the old woman had stuck into the floor. The servant, of course, had no way of knowing why the old woman was pulling hair from a dead body. Therefore, in any rational sense, he did not know whether it should be judged good or evil. But for the servant, the mere act itself, pulling hair from a corpse here above Rashomon on this rainy night, was already an unforgivable evil. Of course, the fact that until just before this, he himself had been thinking of becoming a thief had long since slipped entirely from his mind. So then, the servant planted strength into both legs and suddenly sprang up from the staircase onto the floor above. Then, with one hand on his sacred hilted sword, he strode in long steps straight toward the old woman. It goes without saying that the old woman was startled. The moment she caught sight of the servant, she leaped up as though shot from a crossbow. "You wretch, where do you think you are going?" The servant, blocking her path as she stumbled over the corpses and tried in panic to flee, shouted this abuse at her. Still, the old woman tried to push past him. The servant, in turn, shoved her back, determined not to let her escape. And there among the corpses, the two of them grappled wordlessly for a while. But the outcome had been clear from the beginning. At last, the servant seized the old woman's arm and twisted her down to the floor by force. It was an arm like a chicken's leg, nothing but bone and skin. "What were you doing? Speak. If you do not speak, this is what you shall have." The servant flung the old woman aside, and in the same instant swept his sword clear of the scabbard, thrusting the white gleam of the steel before her eyes. And yet the old woman said nothing. Her hands trembled violently. She gasped for breath through her shoulders, and her eyes opened so wide that the eyeballs seemed ready to spill out beyond her eyelids. Like one mute, she kept stubbornly silent. Seeing this, the servant for the first time became clearly aware that this old woman's life or death was entirely under the command of his own will. And with that awareness, the hatred that had been burning so fiercely until now somehow cooled without his noticing. What remained afterward was only the quiet pride and satisfaction that come when one has carried out a certain task and brought it successfully to completion. So, looking down at the old woman, the servant softened his voice a little and said, "I am not an officer from the Kebiyushi office. I am only a traveler who happened just now to pass beneath this gate, so I have no intention of binding you with rope or doing anything of that sort. You need only tell me what you were doing here above this gate at this hour." At this, the old woman opened her eyes even wider than before and fixed them steadily upon the servant's face. She looked at him with sharp eyes like those of a bird of prey. Their lids reddened. Then the lips wrinkled so deeply they had nearly become one with her nose, began to move as though she were chewing some bit of food. In her thin throat, the pointed Adam's apple could be seen moving. And then, from that throat, a voice like the cawing of a crow came to the servant's ears, panting and broken. "I was pulling out this hair, thinking to make a wig from it." The servant was disappointed that the old woman's answer was unexpectedly ordinary, and together with that disappointment, his former hatred came back into his heart, now joined by a cold contempt. Perhaps that expression was understood by the old woman as well. Still holding in one hand the long strands of hair she had torn from the corpse's head, she began to mutter, stammering, in a voice like the croaking of a toad. "Yes, yes, pulling hair from the dead may indeed be an evil thing. But all these dead here, they are all people who deserve at least that much done to them. That woman, for example, the one whose hair I have just pulled out. She used to cut snakes into pieces about 4 sen long, dry them, and sell them at the camp of the Tachiobi guards, calling them dried fish. Had she not died of the pestilence, she would probably still be selling them now. And what is more, they say the dried fish she sold tasted good, and the guards bought them regularly for their meals. I do not think what that woman did was evil. If she had not done it, she would have starved to death. She did it because she had no choice. And so I do not think what I was doing just now is evil either. For if I do not do this as well, I too shall starve to death. I am doing it because I have no choice. And surely that woman, who knew so well what it means to have no choice, would most likely overlook what I am doing too." In substance, this was what the old woman said. The servant returned his sword to its scabbard, and holding its hilt with his left hand, listened to her story with a cold expression. Of course, with his right hand he kept absently troubling over the large pimple festering red on his cheek as he listened. But while he was listening, a certain courage was born within his heart. It was the courage this man had lacked beneath the gate only a little while before, and it was a courage moving in a direction entirely opposite to the courage with which he had climbed to the top of the gate and seized this old woman. The servant no longer hesitated between starving to death and becoming a thief. Indeed, judging from the state of his mind at that moment, the very idea of starving to death had been driven so far outside his consciousness that he could hardly even think of it. Is that so? Is that really so? When the old woman had finished, the servant repeated her words in a mocking voice. Then, stepping one pace forward, he suddenly took his right hand away from the pimple on his cheek, seized the old woman by the collar of her robe, and said, as though biting at her, "Then you will not resent me if I strip you too. For unless I do so, I shall also starve to death." Swiftly, the servant stripped away the old woman's robe. Then, when she tried to cling to his feet, he kicked her roughly down among the corpses. The mouth of the staircase was no more than 5 steps away. Clutching the cypress bark-colored robe he had stripped from her under his arm, the servant rushed down the steep staircase in an instant into the depths of the night. For a while, the old woman lay there as if dead. Then, not long afterward, she raised her naked body from among the corpses, letting out a voice that was half mutter, half groan. She crept, guided by the light of the still burning fire, toward the mouth of the staircase. And from there, with her short white hair hanging wildly downward, she peered beneath the gate. Outside, there was nothing but the vast black hollow of the night. No one knows where the servant went.